This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. You know, it seems like we are constantly bombarded with just sensational news stories of danger and wrongdoing. We've gotten used to overlooking the less spectacular accounts of ordinary goodness, the things that actually fill our everyday lives. But when we routinely ignore these seemingly average or everyday moments, we risk developing a skewed negative perspective on the world around us. Well, today, we're going to turn that tide with our guest, a new thought minister who draws on the wisdom of spiritual masters, all in the name of grounding us in deep compassion for ourselves and the world around us. Edward Viljoen is the senior minister at the Center for Spiritual Living in Santa Rosa, California. He's the author of The Power of Meditation, an ancient technique to access your inner power, and the Kindle book Bhagavad Gita for Beginners, the Song of God in Simplified Prose. Edward has also co-authored Spirit is Calling and Practice the Presence, as well as Seeing Good at Work. You can tell Edward's been busy. He also graduated as a Sonoma County law enforcement chaplain in April of 1999, received a doctorate of divinity from Centers for Spiritual Living, and was awarded the much-respected Ernest Holmes Award for exemplary demonstration of the teachings of Dr. Ernest Holmes. And in his latest book, a big part of what we're going to focus on today is entitled Ordinary Goodness, the surprisingly effortless path to create a life of meaning and beauty. Edward believes that the complete and fulfilled life is comprised of garden variety acts of kindness and faith and compassion. It's an essential handbook for those seeking simple methods to create a life well lived. Edward, thanks for coming on The Meaningful Way.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. So maybe before we dive in to your latest work, I'd like to go a little bit back in time for you. And you've most likely heard the phrase or some derivative, probably even used it, of the idea of standing on our pillars of faith. We all want to feel grounded and centered and hone in on that sense of inner peace. So I was curious, what is it that drew you to the spiritual path that you're living now? Was there a moment or an upbringing or a particular experience that unfolded you to help you find this way?
I think I was a seeker from the very beginning, that I started reading and looking around me and taking interest in the world. I think I very early on in life wanted to feel connected to what I would call the mystery. And so I started at a very early age visiting faith traditions, including my own, and along the way picking up practices that sort of became a toolbox for navigating through the world. And I have those now, and they form part of my daily routine, and they do exactly what you said. They ground me for the day so that I can get the most out of my life, and I can give back, because these practices fill up my inner resources. So I'm operating from full tanks instead of from desperation and emptiness. I think they're vital.
That's interesting, because I think there's a lot of that prevailing right now, which is how is it that we continue to fill ourselves up and kind of tune in the direction and the way of life that we want to have, as opposed to what we may feel like is being bombarded at us all day long. I know one of the things that you've recently turned to, and I was curious to have you elaborate on more of this, was that you've been talking more about value-based living and values-based living, I should say. And so I was hoping you could say a bit more of what do you see? How is it that you define the idea of values-based living, but also go into a bit of why now? Because this seems to be a conversation that's emerging a lot more often right now.
Yes, these are very turbulent times, and people are struggling to have confidence that there are values that they can turn to. And I think it's causing a lot of people, including me, to question, well, what do I stand for? And then the next step is, if I say I stand for, say, let's take kindness, for example, would somebody observing me be able to tell just from looking at me that that is an actual active value? So I'm very interested in the difference between living my life based on my values in comparison to talking about values and giving them a nod of approval. So I'm looking at, when I say compassion is important, is there a trail of evidence of that in the way I work with my coworkers and the way I show up in the world? And that's been quite eye-opening.
Absolutely. I think that as part of the turbulent times we're seeing right now, I also think that we've seen a great deal of those values shift just in the past 10 years because of the economic climate and the political climate and so many other things that are going on in this world. And I'm curious if, what you've seen in terms of almost it seems like we're redefining what's important to us. And I'm curious what you've seen. Yeah,
we are, and we're having to learn how to talk about that with each other and how to be in conversation with people when we are in disagreement with them, and how that can cause us to brush up against our values, especially the one of kindness and compassion. If I say I'm kind and compassionate, or I believe that there is a unity of life that connects us, then how do I explain that when I'm talking to you about your politics or your religion or your economics, that I can treat you in a way that is less than kind? So we're having to go back to the beginning and relearn skills that seem to have fallen by the wayside before we even get to the big issues. Common courtesy, simple respect in communication, and that's quite a task in our world of internet and cell phone and quick, fast connection. It can dehumanize us to the point where the issues become important, and then the human being falls by the wayside.
It's interesting because there's two really, really interesting aspects of that. The first, which I don't want people to lose, was that when you consider your values, we'll use that kindness and compassion as examples of that, considering what does that look like? Right? What does kindness look like when I'm listening not just to somebody I want to be kind to, but somebody that maybe is pushing a few buttons for me right now? How do I practice kindness and compassion then? The second thing, which I love that you brought up, which was this idea of how technology, while it connects us, it disconnects us, right? So it removes that human quality of sitting down and respecting the person across from you.
Yes, because when you're standing on the other side of a screen or you're looking at a cell phone, you don't experience the subtle cues, the nonverbal cues. You don't see the person. So it's almost like you're in a safe zone and you can say things that you wouldn't say to the person if you're actually with them. And that's very interesting, how to bring mindfulness and care into communications, electronic communications, here where I work. When we write emails, we never write them in a heartless way. So we'll begin our emails as if we're writing an actual physical letter, with a salutation, with a question about the well-being of the other person. And we find that slows us down, and we no longer use email as a rapid, heartless way to transfer information. And it takes extra time, but more than affecting the other person, it affects us. Our thinking is more care-filled. The connection is stronger. So, there's a risk of treating somebody like a task or like a possibility instead of connecting with them. Now, the advantage of taking the time to connect with people, no matter what the medium of education is we learn about each other. And it's very difficult to hate on each other when we know each other's story. Yeah.
As soon as you truly begin to understand the person across from you or that you're communicating with in any manner, they're no longer the quote unquote other. They're a person, and they have interests, and they have family, and they have their just particular view on the world, but you can connect to them so much more deeply. You can give them the benefit of the doubt as well. And I think also what you bring up is that just that idea of those little things that can slow us down. And while it feels like they take more time in the moment, it's actually probably saving us so much more time in the future due to miscommunication or lack of understanding. And so we're actually saving ourselves not just probably time, but also a whole lot of energy and emotion down the road as well.
Yeah, it saves us the cleanup for those transactions that are mindless.
Right. And so I think, and I think you've already started to give some examples, which is why I was fascinated by your book, Ordinary Goodness, because what you're really doing is bringing some of these concepts, but you're bringing them to the simple, to the everyday, to the practical and tangible for us. And so maybe if we start here, what was it that compelled you to write this book at this time?
It was exactly what we've been talking about, these turbulent times when people are struggling with the amount of change that's going on around them and the amount of negative biased news that is saturating the airwaves, and they want to have a sense that despite all of this, that there is still something that they can turn to that I call innate goodness, and that when they do turn to it, they can develop a confidence that it will help them to live a life that is meaningful. When they ignore this tendency that they have to connect, to contribute, to be kind, it sort of leads to a feeling of dullness and emptiness. So I'm talking about goodness as the medicine, the antidote, the something that we can turn to help us feel reconnected and live a life of worth.
And one of the things that you share early on in the book is this idea of how we can care about ordinary things, and when we care more about them, it actually can result in an extraordinary life experience. And I was hoping you could expand on that.
Well, I was reading your own website, and you talk about the exact same thing about how the simplest moments in life can be the thing that catapults us into growth and change. And then you say, if you start to look for those moments, and that's the key phrase, and I think that's a lot of what my book is about, is turning our attention from the exaggerated news, from the alarming news, and to look at what is also going on. And what is also going on are these simple moments. They don't have to be extravagant sunsets. They don't have to be the biggest, most beautiful anything. It's sometimes the ordinary acts when a neighbor helps us, or when we help a neighbor, or when we slow down enough to notice also that nature continues to be a source of beauty and restoration. These little adjustments are very meaningful and important. And that key word, that phrase that you wrote, if you start to look for those moments, that represents the beginning of a journey in the direction of more balance.
And what we're doing is we're beginning to tune our minds and specifically our mind's eye for what it is that we want it to find, and it'll bring that to us. It's already around us. We just have to notice it.
Yes, isn't it called the confirmation bias?
Exactly.
About what we're looking for. And so if I'm not looking for anything like altruism, if I'm not looking for how people connect, it's not that it's not there, but it recedes into the background of my attention. So I'm arguing for a more balanced approach to life. So I'm not denying that difficulty is there. I'm saying, goodness, you can open up your awareness.
That's actually what I wanted you to expand on, because in no way is your book about a kind of a blind optimism or a blind faith by any measure. It's much more of this balanced approach. And just say just a little bit more about what you mean in balance and why that's so important.
Yeah, well, it's sometimes through our challenges and our challenges and tragedies that we come face to face with our values and our desire to bring goodness in the world. So this is in no way meant to say that life is easy or put on rose-colored glasses. It's more about finding the goodness despite the difficulties that are going on, while tragedies are around us, and then looking to role models who have stood up in the midst of tremendous tragedy and demonstrated a way of being in the world that brings courage and inspiration.
So let's actually, I want to shift, because there's a lot more I could continue to ask you about, but there's a few other things I want to make sure we get to, because inside of the book, and it's broken down for everybody, when you pick this up, it's broken down into 5 parts. And what's interesting is I have a feeling these 5 parts are very near and dear to your own values-based life, Edward. And these 5 parts are ordinary goodness, ordinary kindness, ordinary compassion, and ordinary faith. The 5th part is around finding that faith and examining what it is that you believe. And so you've begun to give us that idea of what is ordinary goodness, but I was hoping you could share a bit more about the rest of these: ordinary kindness, compassion, faith, and then we'll chat a little bit about that idea of finding and examining our faith.
Yeah, they sort of lead into each other. And I think when one starts the journey of noticing goodness, noticing that there is a paradox of goodness and whatever else you want to call it, eventually it starts the spark in us to be kind, because when we learn about each other, kindness rises up naturally. And then when one flirts with kindness, it's inevitable that bond heart to heart will strengthen. And then compassion, in one one of its most beautiful forms of altruism will start to waken up naturally. And then the more we play in the world of compassion and connection, the stronger that muscle becomes. So our experience of it becomes better. We can predict where kindness will go, and I call that faith, experience-based faith. And when we stick with that, eventually that opens us to this consideration of the world, that there's so much more going on than what I do and who I am. There's a mystery, and practices of faith will take us deeper into that eventually.
I absolutely love what would on its surface be almost a contradiction in terms of experience-based faith.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about that. I absolutely love that term.
Well, you start off, I've got to have proof, right? Mm-hmm. So then the more I practice being kind, I see that, yes, it does have a payoff, a payback, but then I realize simultaneously there's this unknown. People may not receive my kindness the way I intended. I'm still vulnerable. I may be taken advantage of. And then that point comes where you say, I'm going to take the leap of faith anyway without the guarantee. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the outcome is, and so it moves from experience-based mm-hmm. faith into something else. People have called it an inner knowing. I talk about my grandmother in that part of the book where she would say, whenever we would bring our trials to her, she would say, it's all going to work out in the end. Mm-hmm. And it would drive us crazy because how could she know that? And so she had, over the years, gathered this confidence that even though she didn't know how or what the steps were, that things would work out in the end.
It's interesting because one of the phrases that certainly I use often and has come up on this show is this idea of trusting the process. And what I love in which you're highlighting is that as part of trusting the process, we're out there building the type of experience that will allow us to trust more and trust more in a process that we have experience around and that we've kind of consciously created for ourselves. And that's what it sounds like you're doing, is that you're consciously creating the types of experiences that will bring you to the type of life and type of experience of life that you're looking to have.
And when you practice these values and these practices that slow us down and help us to notice and connect, we become confident in them. And then even if the landscape changes suddenly or catastrophically, now we have something to refer to. Now, when we don't have anything to refer to and a tragedy hits us, then we're throwing it into chaos. So we are building a survival kit or toolkit to navigate life. And life is filled up with changes and sudden turns, and it's really worthwhile to have somewhere to go to that you know the way to. And for example, kindness and compassion, or even meditation, something that you've made a familiar dwelling place in your life, and that helps in times of sudden change.
So if you can relate these a bit, relate this conversation, relate these key parts a bit to how can we use them to discover our path, to find a way to find our purpose, let alone live what we believe to be our purpose?
I think that one of the exercises I talk about is imagine, it's a little macabre, but imagine it's the future and you've passed away and somebody's standing at your memorial and they're saying, to know Edward was to know that he valued, and then imagine what would they say? Because you will start to be able to tease out of this imaginary scenario how it is you're showing up already. And that is the starting place to discover what you're about. And for some people, they've never thought about that. How do I show up? How do people experience me in the world? Because that is telling the story already of what's important to me. And then I can match that to, is this the way I want to be in the world? Am I contributing enough to match my imagined idea of how I want to be in the world? And then we can bring an adjustment into play. If people aren't experiencing me the way I want to show up, that's me. That's something I can do. And, if I can't imagine what people would say, I could ask somebody that I know, choose somebody that you love, of course. And so I asked them, how do you think I'm showing up in the world? And then that will begin the journey. And then the next step I can ask myself is that where I want to be? What's missing from the picture? Because then I can start inserting that.
It's interesting because the image that I just got in my head is a few things. One is that when you project out to where you just did so that you can look back on life and see, what is it that I want people to be able to say, it gives you that kind of retrospective view at the same point. But then when you bring it back to, is that where I am? Is that who I am right now? And then you can fast forward and say, based on who I am right now, if I fast forward this movie, is it ending up with that, eulogy, as it were, that I would love to be able to receive one day? And it's a great way of kind of looking at it from both directions.
Right. And when we've got radar on each other, so fakery won't do this. I can't be fake kind. I can't be fake connecting because people will see right through me, and then they won't be able to bring forth those elements that we see each other. So this is really about finding out what do I actually want to be in the world. And then the bigger questions, what do I believe about life? What do I believe about divinity or religion or anything you want to ask? And ask yourself, if you were being interviewed on a radio like this or on television or writing an article for a local newspaper, and you were asked to write about that, what do you believe? What would you say? And I think very few people have really taken a moment to think that through with earnestness and seriousness. I know as a young man, I could repeat what I'd been taught in school and in church, but I hadn't really sat down and thought about what do I really believe in? And that was a turning point.
Yeah, I've heard, in many instances, and this is something I've even used with clients as well that I've worked with, is getting them to think about what are those things that you would say, this is what life is worth living for, and getting them to really reflect on that and then be able to take a look at their beliefs and the way they're showing up and be able to relate it in that regard. Because most of us, as you just said, we don't consciously sit down and look at those things and then engineer our life based off of it.
Yeah, and it's such an important question, especially as technology connects us in a new way, and in-person, face-to-face, community-type experiences are moving into the back burner. And I think when people think about this, what is life really about? They see the moments that they shine are the moments that when they are with people and they are doing something that is mutually nourishing, and that's coming back where people are realizing, yeah, we're communal. We like being together with balance, but is it missing in my life right now? And people can recover their sense of community even if they live isolated lives by considering volunteer opportunities. There's so much work that can be done in the world in this regard. When people go out and connect that way, not only does it help the world and satisfy that need, it also helps a person feel better about themselves.
Yeah. It's probably the greatest gift we can give anymore is our time, more so than anything else. One other area I wanted to touch on just before we get down to some of the kind of the practices and routines that you personally use, let alone espouse to help create some of this. But this other area that I've heard you chat a bit about is this idea of the importance of awe and how awe can relate to creating that more meaningful life. And I was wondering if you could share more on that.
Yes, or is that look that we're stunned by something into the state of being an observer with the eyes wide open and taking it all in. And I'm a believer in also seeking out those moments that let ourselves be awe-filled. And what I've noticed is you and I can be awe-filled with anything if we slow down enough to take it in. An apple is a miracle. If I take a moment and really look at it and examine every part of it and figure out how it came into being or what it smells like. So it doesn't need to be anything extraordinary or large. Our world tells us that it's got to be spectacular, it's got to be fast, it's got to be the best. Well, what I'm finding out that almost anything is worthy of appreciation and awe, modest things. And when I develop the habit of noticing things every single day, awe naturally arises.
Yeah.
And when it does, the world becomes really fascinating.
Yeah, it's that, as we were saying before, it's when you begin to look for it and you begin to find that everyday awe, it's right there, and it connects you to such a wonderful feeling of the presence, being present, being in the moment, right? So let me ask you, because you've referenced it, early on in the call, and we've kind of been dancing around it, but what are some of those simple things? What are the routines, the practices that help us infuse our lives with more ordinary goodness?
I think in this world, the ones that slow us down have become the most important to me recently. So I began my day with practices that slow me down. And you call it meditation. You can call it mindfulness practices. Sometimes all I do is sit. I'll put a timer on, and I have no agenda. I don't try to make my mind do anything. I don't examine the content of my mind. I just adopt the role of an observer. And even if I sit for 5 minutes, it is remarkable how much our physiology responds to 5 minutes of motionless sitting. It's not boring. It's quite wonderful. And when I do it, the whole day starts on a different tone.
Yeah.
So I don't even have to introduce any spiritual or religious meaning on it. I just sit. And out of that sitting, noticing arises. The mind does what it does. It's either busy or it's not. It either makes lists or it doesn't. But eventually, I realize that there's a part of me that's observing what the mind is doing. And that part of me that's observing is rather peaceful. And because I've taken the moment to be still, I'm becoming better acquainted with this part of me that appreciates being attended to. And I think that tremendous wisdom is in that part. So instead of listening to the fast-paced moving of my mind that has all the lists and all the things to do and all the arguments with relatives and politicians, if I listen to that observer in me, it's often tremendously sane.
It's amazing how often this show comes back to certain roots in whether it be mindfulness or meditation or even prayer, to have those quiet moments, because when we do, it's that clutter that's been on our mind ultimately has the chance to empty out. And then we find that voice that you're talking about that actually is quite sane, quite wise, very intuitive, and knows a lot of really good stuff for us. We've got to listen. So what happens when we begin to apply even a simple daily practice for 5 minutes like that? Where does that go? At 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months out, what are some of the changes we begin to notice in our lives?
It's very similar to learning to play a musical instrument. In the beginning, let's take, for example, a violin. The sounds that come out of a beginner violinist is not always pleasant. And then one has to learn to hold one's hand in what is an unnatural way. And then by the third day, you may not feel inclined to do it, let alone by the 6th week. But eventually there comes a moment where the instrument becomes an extension of the person. And then music emerges. And it's difficult to explain to a beginner violinist that one day what emerges from them will come through the instrument and into expression, because it's just too far out there. It's very similar when we sit, our practice, whatever. People have different spiritual practices and they all work the same way. Whatever it is, prayer, affirmative prayer, meditation, mindfulness, reciting prayers, whatever it is. And you get your practice, and the one from your religion of origin is probably a good place to start. And then you begin to practice it. And in the beginning, it seems rote. It seems maybe not even to be feeling very connected to anything. But that's because you're learning to play it. Then there comes a time where it is an anchor. It's so you go to it so frequently that it becomes an extension of your being. And there comes a point down the road where then what is in you comes forth, and it comes forth through you, through the extension of your being that is your practice. And that is a path that is very difficult to explain to the beginner meditator or the beginning prayer or the person who's just starting, because we want instant results. I want to do a mindful practice and I want to be enlightened by this afternoon.
It's amazing because when one of the things I know in what you're describing, which that just reminded me of, is that in call it the early days of my own meditation practice, one of the first things that I did notice was, maybe it was a few weeks in, maybe a little bit longer, was that when I was out of that space, meaning I was, busy in the usual day, it got a little crazy or whatever it was that was going on, was that with those couple of quick mindful breaths, how easy it was to start to get back to that calmer place. And then the more that happened, the more that all of a sudden this other stuff started to be able to come through because I was getting out of my own way.
Right. Yes, that's exactly right. When you know the way there, it may take a long time to get used to that way, and then when you need to visit it and you're in a busy scenario, you can go there quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
is that almost like a consciousness on demand?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as opposed to going over to one of the streaming movie sites, go over to your breath and let that consciousness on demand come through. So if we want to tie this all together, as you know, the name of the show, the central theme here is the meaningful way. And we've covered some incredible topics of goodness and faith and compassion and awe and kindness so far in our conversation today. But from your own journey, from where you sit today, what would you say is your meaningful way?
I would say that kindness is my meaningful way, and in particular, I'm interested in how I am a role model because I've benefited so much from other people who have been a role model to me. It's helped me become aware that people are watching, young people are watching, other people are being affected, and so I don't live my life only for myself. So bringing that value into my actions and my choices, that has become my way.
Outstanding. Edward, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all of the wisdom as well as the wonderful insights of your latest book, Ordinary Goodness. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
And for everyone out there listening, consider that. What if your meaningful way was based on kindness or was based on compassion? How is it that would begin to play out in your life? And I love that closing thought and almost a closing question that I'd like to pose to you is that idea of what type of role model would you want to be for others? Remember, whether you are a spouse, a partner, a parent, a teacher, a nurse, an entrepreneur, an executive, or what have you, there's many people that are looking up to you at any given time, and you can impact and influence them in any number of ways. So what type of role model do you want to be? What type of impact and influence do you want to have on them? And so as always, until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for tuning in to The Meaningful Way. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and please subscribe and follow along with all these great guests, their stories and interviews. Also, it helps us a lot if you not only share some of your favorite episodes online, but also provide us feedback. Go into iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app happens to be, and rate the show. Provide us some feedback and let us know how it is that we're doing. If you want to learn more about what we're up to, whether it be with the iPet Coach Training School, the Live, Lead, Play Network, or even just what's evolving with The Meaningful Way, go on and head on over to lukeiorio.com.